welcome back. This is our lecture series for Brookings Mountain West. This is our second year. We're happy to have a big turnout tonight for Jim Johnson, who will speak in a moment. And just a couple of words up front. We're going to have another lecture, I think, on October 26th with Alan Malich, who's going to talk about the foreclosure crisis, and he's an expert in housing from the Brookings Institution in the East. And I just want to say, again, a couple of quick notes of where we are in terms of this lecture series. We are doing this lecture series, bringing folks to Washington, doing conferences to bring public policy discussion to this region, to deal with national and international issues that interest people in Las Vegas. And we are a kind of hot space right now. Everybody wants to know about our election, as a matter of fact. So we've had no problem attracting all sorts of high-profile guests who've written extensively about the politics of this space and where we are as far as public policy, in part because what happens here is really reflective of the country as a whole. We've seen a recession. We felt this recession worse than other places. A little bit of background, just to note that in my own bio, I am connected with Jim Johnson in that in the mid-1990s, I was hired by Fannie Mae to work at the Office of Housing Research when Jim Johnson was CEO of the corporation. And so I'm familiar with him from way back in the 1990s. And one of the legacies that Jim Johnson gave Fannie Mae was an Office of Housing Research that did actually academic research in housing. The idea was that there was a lack of focus in housing research in the academic community, especially fields like urban planning. And as a result, Fannie Mae made a strategic investment and tried to lift the research and scholarship in that area. And I remember when we started out, only about 10% of the articles that came into the National Association, that was the National Association for Urban Planning Faculty, was housing and community development related. About 2-3 years later, it was a third. That's how much we lifted production. And one other legacy was the journal Housing Policy Debate, which Fannie Mae Foundation started 20 years ago. And Fannie Mae, rather, started 20 years ago, switched it to the foundation. When I went to Virginia Tech, I took it with me. And it is still published. It's the third ranked journal in terms of the power rating in urban studies out of about 75 journals. And UNLV is going to partner with Virginia Tech so that we still participate in this journal, so that the legacy of Jim Johnson continues within this institution. And without further ado, Neil Smastrick, our president.
Well, I just have to thank you. What a great crowd tonight. It's a full house, and I think it's an incredible time to have a full house because we have a really wonderful speaker here tonight. Now, I do have to kind of first say, any of you who thought that this was Jimmy Johnson from the Dallas Cowboys, who was recently voted off Survivor, this is the wrong lecture. And this is Jim Johnson, who is far smoother, more polished, and yet much more influential. So we have with us tonight a number of people who claim they don't want to be acknowledged, but I think it would be remiss for me not to. About a year and a half ago, we began an interesting conversation. And that conversation went on with Brian Greenspun and Strobe Talbot and Lindy Schumacher and a whole bunch of other folks who basically said, you East Coast guys out there in Brookings, you got to learn a little bit about the West Coast and what's going on, and not just California. We always feel like we've been passed over. And so we began working on creating a partnership. And one of the material impacts of that partnership is that we created the Brookings Mountain West Initiative. And I'm going to tell you that this lecture series is one that we're going to participate in tonight, the lecture series that's been enriching our campus, the lecture series that's bringing very hot, current, important topics to our campus, along with the scholars who know those topics best, along with scholars who are interacting with our students. And I know Jim today just spent part of the day in an econ class talking a little bit about what got him the path he followed to the point he is today. All of those types of things are demonstrative of a relationship that is a great match that's become deeper and richer. And as we move forward with ventures around the development of curriculum so that our students here will be able to understand the commitments in our great society that they have towards building prosperity and better futures. We know that those Brookings relationships will move forward and that they're going to change UNLV. And in turn, we hope to change Brookings just a little by embedding in them some of that great spirit of our frontier region, some of what Las Vegas has to bring to the table, but also understandings of the needs and urgencies of our region as opposed to what might be most commonly thought of inside the Beltway. Bill, I really thank you, as always, for your participation and now for your friendship. It's wonderful. And Lindy, who does not want to be acknowledged, I thank you for the catalytic effect that the formation of the Lindsay Institute has had on our relationship. And this is one that I know is growing and will continue to prosper. Tonight, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Jim Johnson. He's been a leader, as you all know, in American politics and economic circles for over three decades. Jim will provide us tonight an overview of how we're going to climb out of the great panic of 2008 and how we're going to look ahead to our upcoming midterm elections, where Nevada has been one of the national focus areas, and how the seating of the 112th Congress will occur. Described by many as one of the most influential and well-connected men in the United States, Jim's held leadership positions. And he's sitting here wincing right now. No one likes to hear their bios, but it's so impressive, Jim. We got to give it to people. Held leadership positions in business, arts, and politics. As a Democratic Party political figure, Mr. Johnson was one of the earliest and most prominent supporters of Senator Barack Obama's presidency of the 2008 nomination. He was campaign chairs for John Kerry, campaign manager for Walter Mondale, and he has had an incredible career that got him to those positions. From 1991 to 1998, he served, as you've just heard, as the Chief Executive Officer of Fannie Mae. Previously, he was Vice Chairman, and before that, a Managing Director of Lehman Brothers. And you must be shaking your head now at the state that everyone's in. He is also a member of the board of Goldman Sachs, and he's been Vice Chairman of Perseus LLC, a merchant banking and equity firm, since April 2001. He's chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Brookings Institution, and he's wearing that hat with us today, along with the great depth of experience that he has. He's a member of the Business Council and the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. Now, I can go on and on and on, Jim, because I've got about 5 pages of this, but what I'm going to tell you all is that his depth of experience in economics, political leadership, and really helping our nation, and now in his role in the Brookings Institution, has created a number of incredible opportunities, has mentored many, many important people, has developed talent, has brought, I think, one of the most encouraging careers to the fore as we look at his achievements. So we are going to be in for a treat tonight. We're going to be in for a talk that I think will really help all of us understand the situation we're in, and maybe even help us locate where Nevada is within that situation. And so with that, I would ask you to please welcome Jim Johnson with a warm round of applause for his lecture here tonight.
I don't know.
Oh, it is.
Actually, some microphone is on. Yeah, I think I have one clipped on. Anyway, good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to see some old friends and people who I'm well aware of in the terms of their enormous contribution to this community and this state. I'm delighted that so many of you are here, but the people who I'm most impressed with are a couple of the students who I saw who did an hour with me earlier this afternoon who are back for more. So I'll try it. Thank you very much. I consider very flattered. It's interesting you would begin with a small Jim Johnson reference. I don't know what might be comparable at UNLV by way of confusing names, but I went to the University of Minnesota as an undergraduate. And in my sophomore year at the University of Minnesota, there were 18 Jim Johnsons in the student directory. And so I'm used to this. You've probably seen the topic for this talk, and that is 2 years ago to the financial crisis and 2 weeks to the midterm elections. That gives me about 26 months of material to talk about in, I hope, a relatively brief and efficient way. Incidentally, I have 7 sort of guiding principles or thoughts or insights or conclusions about that 26-month period that I'm going to share with you. And I'm going to share them, I think, quickly with you up front, because we can address the depth of this conversation and our dialogue and your questions and my responses and your responses and my questions. I think if you guide this or help guide this a little bit with me, because there's so much material, there's so much that happened. And I will do just a little bit more biographical work, not because I'm so eager to hear even more about myself, but my perspective on so much of this is guided by the opportunities that I've had, that I've been so fortunate to have. And so when we talk about what's going to go on with the Congress, I worked for a number of different senators. I worked actually for 11 Democratic candidates for the presidency of the United States. When we talk about business, an old partner of mine from Lehman Brothers I see here in the audience. Lehman, as you may have heard, no longer exists. It wasn't our fault, actually. And but when we talk about the financial crisis, and you may consider this to be an evidence of not being qualified to talk about it rather than to be qualified to talk about it, but in the fall of 2008, from Labor Day to Thanksgiving, as the longest serving member now of the Goldman Sachs board, we had 22 board meetings between Labor Day and Thanksgiving trying to figure out how this one firm would navigate our way through the financial crisis and survive. My time at Fannie Mae was fascinating. It was the largest financial institution in the United States at that time. During the time that I was there, we financed 17 million homes, and we felt that we had the key to expanding home ownership in a way that was responsible and that would put people into homes, give them an opportunity to own, give them a chance to have appreciating assets, and when it's all said and done, would strengthen our country and make it a brighter future for so many families. I think what we did was enormously successful. It is no longer successful. And so one of the things that we can get into is that I know there's a tremendous housing crisis in Nevada, and it's something that I spent many years of my life focused on very, very closely, very carefully. So what I thought I would do is first start on an optimistic note, and this is also to some extent sequential. And anybody who wants to interrupt me at any point, please just raise your hand and we'll go to where you want to go to. I'll give you the quick overview at the beginning of these sort of 7 stopping points during these last 26 months, and then we can go from there to more specific conversation. The first note is a very encouraging note, and that is that in the fall of 2008, the global financial system was in fact very close to collapse. There were very serious challenges put to the government of the United States, to the G20, the other major industrial economies around the world, and through a very unusually high level of policy coordination among the 20 industrialized countries and 20 most significant countries economically, the G20, there was an enormously successful coordination of policy. And even though it has been viewed now not very positively by many, if you look at the response of the United States government during the fall of 2008 and the first quarter of 2009, the policies emanating from Washington, I believe, did save the American and global financial system. Many much criticized programs, like the TARP, for example, where $700 million was devoted to propping up and saving major banks, other financial institutions, auto companies, whatever, is now calculated to be paid back, or to be likely to be paid back in over $650 billion. So into the 90-some% range, this money will all be paid back. We did lose some major institutions. We have some institutions that still have government investment in them. We have, of course, institutions that failed, large and small. We had a lot of dislocation in the economy. We had a real crash of personal confidence in many cases. But when you look at the steps that were taken first by the Bush administration, Hank Paulson and his team at Treasury then, and then the follow-up actions taken by the Obama administration, including, in my judgment, the stimulus package, which was passed immediately after Obama became president, you have a series of steps and actions which, in fact, gave the American financial system the opportunity to recover, and that recovery now gives us an opportunity to extend the pulling out of the recession and giving people once again a solider financial footing. So the first note is, I think, a good note, a solid note, a positive note about the success of public policy. The second note is not a positive note, and that is that the recession that followed from that financial catastrophe has been much deeper and longer and more serious and more threatening to more families in the United States than anybody anticipated. As a matter of fact, one of the most quoted observations early in the Obama administration was by the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, Christine Romer, who said, "We believe unemployment will top at 8%. As you know, it's 9.6 nationally. In a number of states, Nevada, Michigan, and others, it's substantially more severe than that. The recovery has been weaker than it has been coming out of many other recessions. We still have an uncertain note coming from Washington about the nature of economic policy that we're going to have. We have tax proposals that are on the table as soon as the election is over. When the lame duck session starts a month from now, we will be back into the question of whether or not we will extend the Bush tax cuts or not. We have a deficit reduction, a bipartisan deficit reduction commission that will report on the 1st of December. And we will be right back in this question of what will be the nature of economic policy coming from Washington. And at the moment, we can't be very optimistic about the year ahead. I just reviewed a lot of economic predictions as I was preparing for this talk. The economist who I happen to like as well or better than others was a fellow who worked with me for a decade at Fannie Mae, David Burson. I got all of his latest predictions. He was the chair of the Business Economists Association. I think is generally, in addition to being an expert on housing, which of course I'm interested in very deeply, in addition to the rest of the picture. And if you look at his growth anticipation, his numbers for unemployment, and all of those other matters, we are not yet at the end of the bad news. We have some positive growth, but his prediction is that a year from now that we will still have unemployment over 9% nationally, which means that that's a very difficult problem in many, many states. It means it's a very difficult problem for millions and millions of people. And so we have a lot further to go as we think about reestablishing the level of personal confidence and economic strength in the United States. The third point, as I look through this time period, and this is one that's a difficult one for me to get just right as I stated, because once again, I'm an optimistic, upbeat, solution-oriented sort of person. And I can't help but say that the first 2 years of the Obama administration, if I'm going to be honest to the numbers and honest to the survey research and honest to the materials available, have been less successful with the American people than, of course, those of us who supported Obama had hoped for, and certainly than the president hoped for. I don't know if you saw, some of you probably saw the big article in the New York Times on Sunday by Peter Baker, which involved a long talk with Obama and his key people. Excellent piece called The Education of the President. And in that piece, Obama himself talks about this. But one of the things that was so exciting to me, and I'm sure many others in this room about 2008, was that it appeared to be a change election, and that there was going to be a solution and an orientation to having a different kind of Washington, a different kind of bipartisan cooperation, a different element of hope, a different element of trying to mutually analyze and solve our problems. What we find now, almost 2 years later, is that only 37% of Americans support the president's economic policies. 36% of Americans say that they support the health care legislation that was passed. 38% of Americans say that they believe that after the first 2 years, President Obama has built a record which entitles him or leads you to say that he deserves re-election. And of course, we have this economic dislocation and lack of confidence and pessimism. If you look now at the levels of pessimism among the American people, broadly speaking, they are at very, very high levels. They're roughly about a third of the people, 32, 33, 34% of people who say that they expect things to get better in the next year or two. That means you have 66 or 67 or 68% of the people saying they don't expect things to get better in the next year or two. So we came through a period, interesting period, of the 2008 election, very substantial victory. The victory was propelled by young people, by first-time voters, by African Americans and Hispanics. That was all of the Obama margin. And when we get to talking about the 2010 elections, I'll talk a good bit about the composition of the electorate and who's likely to vote this year and who isn't likely to vote this year and so on, because so much of off-year elections has to do with who shows up to vote, because typically there are about a third fewer voters in an off-year election as compared to a presidential year. So we had a 57, 58% turnout in the Obama election. We will probably have in the range of 38, 39% turnout in this election. And that's a big difference. And the composition of who doesn't come to vote and who comes to vote has an enormous amount to do with the outcome. The fourth thing, and this relates some to President Obama, some to the disappointment, some to the recession, some to the difficulties people are facing. But the disconnect now, which you alluded to a little bit in a nice way, but the disconnect between the country and the political leadership and Washington and institutions of all kinds is at a level that is enormously serious. And I've had a dispute with some of my friends in the press where even the New York Times seems every day to glorify anger in America. And they write every day about people are angry, people are angry. And of course, where I grew up in university life, at Princeton and University of Minnesota and Brookings and all these places, we always considered anger to be a sign of immaturity. You're supposed to be analytical. You're supposed to think about a balanced approach. You're supposed to analyze things and work them through carefully. And that anger may enter from time to time, but it's not of the same sort of quality in a democratic dialogue or in a civil society as analysis or point of view or values or other representations. But we do have an angry country, at least in many respects. We have a disconnected country from the political leadership and the political institutions and many other institutions. And we have a distrust of Washington now, which is at the highest level in my lifetime. And so these are all real dynamics as we try to forge bipartisan leadership going forward, and something that we have to deal with. The next point I'd make is about the 2010 elections. We, of course, are now within 2 weeks of the elections. And there is one absolutely startling thing when you look at all of the survey research, all of the numbers, all of the analysis, and that is there are about 40% of Americans who know for sure what they want to do in this election, and they want to come out and do something to send an overwhelmingly strong message that business as usual is not what they want. That they don't want incumbents, they don't want the previous approach, they don't want many of the people who have been considered to be political leaders, and that the energy now is overwhelmingly with people who don't like what they see. So if you look then at the other side of it and you say, okay, so what does that mean for Democrats across the country? Because of course the Democrats control the House and the Senate and the presidency, 30 governorships out of 50, many of the state legislatures. What you have is a situation where Democrats in many cases are saying, we believe we've had the right policy, we believe we've had the right approach to the economy, We believe the new health care legislation and the financial reform legislation is very good for our country. It's the right approach. It's the right policy. And instead what we have is the people who generally believe that giving answer after answer after answer saying they may or may not vote. Or in some cases among young people in the 18 to 29-year-old category now, you have about twice as many people in the 30 and over category as compared with the 18 to 29-year-old category. The over 30 category, almost twice as many say they will vote for sure. So if you look at that Obama margin, if you look at the makeup of the Democratic coalition, what you find is that they are uncertain about their participation or unlikely to participate. And what you see on the other side is a determination to participate and a message that they've embraced that they want to get across. So when you look at all the survey research now, including in Nevada, I'm a longtime friend of Harry Reid's. I have enormous respect for him. And as you look at all these numbers and you see all these dynamics materializing, what you can't get out of all those numbers is, in fact, an accurate measure of who on election day will actually vote. So the survey research people have enormous efforts underway to do the right screen, as it's called, to figure out who should be included in the poll where you're giving the preference as to who you're going to vote for. Because if you're including people in the poll who are not going to vote, that's obviously then going to misrepresent the nature of the outcome. And so you do have now an enormous amount of attention being paid to what is the nature of the protest vote this time. Is it a wave? How many seats will the Republicans win? Will they win the House? Will they win the Senate? I'm perfectly happy to give answers on all these things when we get to the question and answer period as to what my guess is. But all of this is now on the table, and the next 2 weeks is going to be a fascinating period politically. The last piece of this sort of chronology that I've been working on is to try to think ahead to 2011, because it's highly likely that the Republicans will win the House. It is certain that the Democrats will no longer have a filibuster-proof Senate. So we know for sure that governance by the president with big majorities in the House and Senate, we know for sure that's gone. That will not be the case once we get to January of 2011. We also know for sure that we have to have a budget, that we have to have an approach to taxes, that we have to have an approach to economic policy, that we have to pass legislation in a variety of other areas. And for the last 2 years, the Republican response, I hope I don't offend anybody in the room unnecessarily, but the Republican response has been largely to say no to everything and that we will not participate in finding common ground. Now, they would say, of course, the president also has not done enough to find common ground and all of that, but there'll be no governing without common ground once we get past January. People will be forced together in order to find some kind of solution that allows the country to go forward. And we have a lot of things happening right away. And we also, at the same time, once we get to January, and this will be a great comfort to all of you, once we get to January, it will then be 12 months till the Iowa and Nevada caucuses, beginning to select the Republican candidate who will oppose President Obama in 2012. So we are right into the presidential season right after this election. And as you may recall from last time, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were immediately after the midterms elections active in Iowa and Nevada, South Carolina, and New Hampshire, the now chosen four that guide the country's presidential selection process, which I must say whoever cooked up getting Nevada in those four deserves a lot of credit, because there was an enormous focus on the state, and I think it was a real tribute to the state that things worked so well, and it was, in fact, one of the early states that guided that process. Not perfect in every respect, but I think a very nice thing for Nevada. So as we go through 2011, we'll have an extremely political atmosphere. We'll have Republicans in charge of the House, I believe, and in a blocking position in the Senate. We'll have a president, of course, who can veto, and we will have a probably more gridlock even than we've had in the past, and probably more discussed than we've had in the electorate than before, And if we can somehow figure out a way to find enough common ground to come to conclusion on some of the key issues, we will, of course, I think, have a government then that will be dramatically more appreciated than the alternative outcome. So this is just a quick overview of all these topics. I have, to some extent, been in the middle of most of them. Certainly the housing and the political and the presidential and the business and the Wall Street recovery and all the other dimensions of the financial system. And I'd be more than happy to take this conversation wherever any of you would like to go. So I'm open for questions and comments and corrections even. Thank you. Yes?
Since you're, I was wondering if you could paint a picture of what we're leaving on the table or what we're going to look like if Senator Reid is not elected.
I was saying to somebody as I was over the last weekend that I was going to Nevada to give a talk about the last 2+ years, and they said to me, well, isn't that a little tricky? And I said, well, I suppose it is. It's 2 weeks from the election. And they said, what do you intend to say about Senator Reid? And I said, I intend to say that I think he's a very fine man who's done an excellent job in the Senate, who I support, and I feel very confident will continue to be the majority leader in the United States Senate. And they said, well, isn't that going to be a little bit of controversial in a room where I'm sure there'll be people with a lot of different points of view? And I said, well, I think as long as I don't establish myself in any way as knowing anything about Nevada, maybe if I just talk about the Washington end of having observed Harry Reid as an outstanding senator, I can maybe get in and out without too much controversy. But I do think he's a fine man. I think he's a fine senator, and I think he will be the majority leader when the Congress reconvenes in January. In the back.
Yeah, the U.S. economy has lost about 8 million jobs since the end of 2008. You take students graduating from high school and college entering the workforce, we've got a difference of about 10 million jobs to make up. The economy continues to lose jobs. Over the past 4 months, it's lost more. How long do you see the unemployment crisis remaining, and what are ways that the U.S. economy can find a way to add jobs?
Great question. There is some encouragement in the jobs number over the last several months. And the point of encouragement is that we have actually added about 850,000 private sector jobs while we've been losing a lot of public sector jobs. And the biggest number in the public sector job loss, of course, is the temporary workers, several hundred thousand, who were employed by the census. And so that you would expect to lose those jobs, just as you shouldn't have really counted gaining them in the spring of the year as you were beginning to do the census. But the long and short of your question is, how can we find sources of optimism, particularly for younger people entering the workforce in a time like this? And the answer is that the fiscal and monetary policy of the government, I think, it has still not done enough. Stimulus is a bad word. We're now talking all about basically the ability of the Federal Reserve through quantitative easing, or QE2 as it's called in the press every morning. And we're looking now at what can low interest rates over an extended period of time do to allow us to work through the housing crisis and to allow us to take the business investment that's happening and give businessmen sufficient confidence that they can hire again. One of the things that's going on now in the last year is that there's been an accumulation of more and more and more and more cash to the tune now of over $1.5 trillion on corporate balance sheets, because corporations are reluctant to hire because of tax and regulatory uncertainty and simply the stunning dynamic of what businesses have been through in the last 2 years. So I think that the long and short of it is that we can't be very optimistic very quickly. My friend David Burson, who I mentioned to you, believes that by the end of 2012, we will have gone down about 2 percentage points in the unemployment numbers. That is from roughly 9.8 to 7.8. So he believes that roughly a little more than a year from now, we will be under 8%. That's nothing to to either sneeze at or rejoice in. I mean, that's some progress, but not much. And most people don't believe that there will be the capacity to do more stimulus, like the stimulus package passed in February of 2009. So I think what we're looking at is a private sector job growth, decline in unemployment. We're looking at quantitative easing. We're looking at sustained low interest rates. And we're looking at an environment to encourage business investment. Now, all of that is better than the alternative, certainly better than the last 2 years, but we still got a lot more to do. And one of the things, and I don't mean to offend, I'm moving from offending one group to the next group to the next group, but I don't mean to take on the economics department all at once, but one of the things that economists typically do not like is public sector job programs and other things that are sort of temporary job creation stimulus that are not investments for the long term. And they're right in many respects. On the other hand, I think the politics for the president would have been substantially better if it looked like he were doing more tangible things to do something about the employment crisis, particularly in places like Nevada, where it has been so severe. So I am sort of on an 18-month horizon optimistic that things will get better for all the reasons we talked about. But, you know, when you say, Jim, when will we be back to 5%? I don't have any idea whether we'll ever get back to 5%. And I think it's a very serious long-term challenge to the U.S. economy.
Thank you.
Yes.
If I could just follow up on the first question from Linda Schumacher. Given all your years in the Senate and your experience in Washington, could you explain what the stakes are to lose the Senate majority leader and replace that leader with a freshman senator in terms of what Nevada could get in this recovery, for example, infrastructure investment?
Mr. President, Brookings is a nonpartisan, bipartisan, analytically, empirically based institution that doesn't have political views or political preferences. Are you okay, Mr. Antholis? Okay. Now, speaking strictly as an individual, I think Harry Reid has done a fabulous job for Nevada, and a lot would be lost. But I can't go further than that. Yes?
It seemed to me that it kind of all started with the rise in the oil prices, and that the oil is what's going to ultimately dictate what our economy is going to do. And obviously, you know, once the gas prices went up to 5, that signaled all the companies to go into hibernation and start conserving. And then I don't understand exactly how it was that they brought the price of oil down. And how can, obviously we're going through a paradigm shift now to figure out how to do with less oil and so forth. So I don't know, maybe you could clear up what's going on with the oil companies and what the gas prices are going to be doing and so forth.
I think even if I were all-knowing, that would still be a tough question. I think the long and short of the American situation is that we're dramatically over-dependent on oil, and particularly overly dependent on foreign oil. We know that. We know that we have to do something because of climate change. We know that we have to do something for long-term efficiencies. We know we have to do something to deal with America's capacity to fuel our industrial growth and the well-being of our citizens. So alternative energies of all different kinds, natural gas, are going to have to be a dramatically more important part of the solution. And we know all that. And in the stimulus package of last year, there was a tremendous amount of money for research and development on alternative fuels, alternative energy approaches, and there's also finally a change in the so-called CAFE standards in terms of mileage for automobiles. From my point of view, we still are not doing enough. We're not doing enough in many respects, but we're not doing enough to encourage alternative energy and to have people pay the price for overusing oil and overusing foreign oil. And so whether or not we can, Bill Antholis is actually one of the nation's expert on this, and you know, grab him afterwards or put him up here next time. And you can learn a lot more from him than you can from me. But I think this is one of the frustrating things now about American government, American society. Everybody knows we need to change the menu of how we use energy, and everybody knows that our overdependence on foreign oil is causing a tremendous problem for the future of our country. But aside from what we're doing now on a small scale, I don't know what more to do except to make that on a bigger scale and to increase the penalty, or that is, increase the price for people who are overusing carbon. Yes?
Jim, we had Senator Reid had the National Energy Symposium here back in September, and then that was followed on by UNLV had the Clean Energy Forum. One of the things that Senator Reid pointed out is that even he, trying to facilitate getting additional energy initiatives through the state, ran into, at the end, I think it was the MBO, he said, the budget office, CBO, I'm sorry, all of a sudden they had a stake in being able to say no to a project. The question is, what can we do to streamline bureaucracy? It's not just technology. I mean, there's technology ready to go. And is bureaucracy, are the bureaucrats in Washington aware of the cost that they impose on new clean energy projects?
This is very close to home. You recall the name Perseus in my introduction? I think the only Greek god, anybody here do Greek mythology? I think the only Greek god who had a happy ending. But nevertheless, the Perseus is an investment firm. I'm a partner in the firm. And we now have created a new car company. We are using the Hummer plant in South Bend, Indiana. It's been retrofit, retooled, and we are building a special purpose vehicle for the handicapped. If you look at the way handicapped people in wheelchairs are transported around in America, they're typically in gas-guzzling, very heavy, retrofitted vans that have clumsy hydraulic systems and a very, very high level of expense associated with them. We have designed a car which carries people in wheelchairs and which runs on natural gas. So we have no carbon footprint of any consequence. We have the right kind of ramps to go into the car, and our assembly line is moving. And it's unbelievably impressive. I'm not urging anybody to go out and buy one because you can't yet, but in any case, very interesting project. We are now, I think, and is anybody here from the Department of Energy who's going to turn me in? I think we're in our 11th month of our loan document negotiation for a loan for this vehicle. And I think we'll ultimately get the loan, but the need to move quickly in Washington is always overcome by the overwhelming desire of people not to be criticized, not to make a mistake, not to let something go prematurely. I mean, the levels and levels and levels on top of levels and levels and levels of clearances for any government funding project is way out of control. And I like the old story about Donald Trump building the skating rink in Central Park, where the government had worked on it for several years, and he finally just said, I'll build it. Get out of my hair and I'll build it. Right? I mean, in order to get the urgency now of the alternative energy impact, we have to have somebody who is on top of the re-engineering of getting the money to work where it's needed. And it is a huge problem. It's a huge problem. Yes?
Actually, I read an article recently that Bank of America was removing some of the freezes on their mortgages, or the foreclosures rather. About 100,000 of them.
That they were removing what?
The foreclosures.
Yes, but what was Bank of America removing, or did I?
They're removing the freeze on the foreclosures, so they were allowing the foreclosures to continue.
Yeah.
I also read another article that said they lost about $7 billion because of the credit renew the credit law or bill that was recently passed, and certain fees that they couldn't apply to.
This is the
overdraft.
credit card law.
Yeah, exactly. So is it according to this? I mean, it seems as if Bank of America is trying to recoup certain costs by maybe removing the freeze on the foreclosures, or is it a sign of the times that maybe they see that people can process foreclosures now because people can satisfy the payments, or I mean, is there anything justification for why they're removing the freeze so early?
Well, apparently you're going to have one of the experts in the world in 2 weeks on all of this. I know a lot about it, but I'm sure not nearly as much as he does, so maybe you should come and ask your question again, but let me take a crack at it. The controversy of the last month involving J.P. Morgan and Bank of America and a number of the other largest mortgage servicers has had to do with a shortcutting of the legal process in order to notify people in the states where there is a judicial process. 23 states, you have to go through the courts in order to foreclose. 27 states, you don't. So in the 23 states, it's an average of about 2 years from the time that you have somebody stopping making their mortgage payment till you actually have a foreclosure that the court has approved. So it's a very, very lengthy, difficult system. Bank of America and J.P. Morgan and some others basically skipped a couple of stages in that process where they were stamping people's signatures who said in what they signed that they had personally reviewed the documents and they were certain of the quality and content of the documents and so on. And these were being rubber stamped essentially on an assembly line where somebody was basically just stamping signatures. And so a number of people stood up and said, this isn't fair, and this raises a question as to whether or not this foreclosure should have the same legal status as one that was legally, properly, procedurally, properly done. And so over the course of the last month, J.P. Morgan, Bank of America, Citi, a number of others said, okay, we will freeze the foreclosure process. We will go back and review our legal processes. We will change the legal processes, and we will make sure that if we made mistakes, that we own up to it. So what's happened now in the last 2 days, which you saw probably on the front page of the Wall Street Journal yesterday or today, is that Bank of America and GMAC Finance and a couple of others said, we have now reviewed our legal process. We are now going to do the legal process properly, but at the same time, we have also reviewed all of these foreclosures, and as far as we know, we made no mistakes in terms of where the foreclosure should have been done. So it appears at the moment, you never know how these things change, it appears at the moment that it was basically an administrative snafu as opposed to some sort of premeditated strategy, for some nefarious purpose. On the credit card law, I think one of the things that we're seeing, and I don't know if there are banking experts in the room here either, but one of the things we're seeing now as a result of the crisis is that the new capital standards for banks, and the new legislation on credit cards, the new legislation on derivatives, the new legislation on the so-called Volcker rule, having to do with trading for your own account or so-called proprietary trading, that there are lots and lots of changes now that have to do with the profitability of banks. And therefore, bank stocks, Bank of America stock was either at an all-time low or it was a 24-month low or whatever today. And so the optimism that banks are going to be making a good return on equity is going down. The same thing as Citigroup. I mean, Citigroup is now, the government has announced that it's taking the second to last stage of their ownership out of Citigroup, and the stock is at $4. And so what you have is bankers, broadly defined, saying if we have to have more capital, we can't make the money we used to make on credit cards, we can't do the things we want to do around foreclosures, we can't do the trading we used to do, we can't do this, we can't do that. How do we maintain our return on equity? How do we keep our stock price up? And how do we keep ourselves viable? And I don't know whether or not, I think it's probably not right to think about the foreclosure behavior of Bank of America being directly related to the increased or decreased profitability of their credit card segment. On the other hand, every day they're sitting around saying, we have a decreased profitability in credit cards. What are we going to do about it? because, you know, we still want to be a viable financial institution that people want to invest in. And it is the biggest bank in America. So the foreclosure stuff is so confusing. And the interesting thing now, you'd think that the White House, particularly given the way President Obama has talked about business in the last 2 years, you'd think that the White House would have jumped on this moratorium and said, yes, let's have a moratorium. Over the weekend, the White House came out and said, no, we're not for this moratorium on foreclosures. That was what helped so much in the 1930s, where there was a mortgage moratorium that allowed people to keep their farms in the Midwest and so on. And they said, we don't want a mortgage moratorium unless there have been actual mistakes made, because if all we do is slow down foreclosure, then we slow down the housing recovery, because we're not going to get those homes onto the market, we're not going to get them sold, and we're not going to clear the market. And so the White House came out over the weekend, David Axelrod on one of the Sunday shows came out and said, much to the surprise of some, we don't support a moratorium in mortgage foreclosures. And we want to get this worked through as quickly as we can, which I think is the right policy. But the banks, and I'm sure there'll be no one in the room who will probably get tearful at this, but the banks are having a tough time figuring out what to do with this new environment. It's a more demanding environment, more capital, and less areas to find profitability. Yes, in the back.
What role, if any, do you see trade policy playing in the recovery?
Another good question, and probably the only source of optimism now that you hear in Washington about bipartisanship. And that is that there are people walking around Washington now who say that with the Republicans back where they're likely to be in the House, and the Republicans likely to be where they're going to be in the Senate, meaning probably more votes for free trade agreements, the bilateral free trade agreements that have been negotiated, maybe we can actually finish the free trade agreement on Korea. The Colombia and Korea and Panama and 2 or 3 others have been in this sort of daisy chain of waiting to get consideration. The Obama administration has been reluctant to bring them forward, in large part because there's an uncertain message, I think, from the Obama administration on trade, but also they were worried that they wouldn't get enough Democratic votes conceivably to pass them, or at least if they did pass them, it would look as though the president had been rejected by his own party. But I think what we're likely, we may have a little bit of a source of optimism here, and the one that people talk about most at this stage is the Korean Free Trade Agreement as a likely positive product of the new Washington configuration starting in January. I probably have been ignoring over here. How about all the way over? Well, correct.
Okay, we've become a credit-reliant society in a lot of ways, which is a good thing because it's allowed individuals to be able to invest in long-term things like homes and businesses and that sort of thing. But at the same time, it's been very much abused by a lot of consumers, mainly through credit cards. What do you think about, because in the past we've had health education reform passed on our public schools, so that because our society was becoming overweight or unhealthy, our public schools were required to teach health education in order for someone to graduate from high school. What do you think about an economic education requirement in order to graduate from high school, so that people understand credit and the way that that works for and against them going through their lives?
You know, I've spent most of the last several decades talking, and so I've talked about almost everything in the world. I've never been asked that before. At first blush, I'd say absolutely yes. I mean, if you look at the long-term capacity of people to manage income and credit and exposure and risk and evaluate financial products, that is an enormous benefit to society if people do that right. And it's really the story of the subprime crisis. I mean, I know you mentioned credit cards particularly, but if you look at the subprime crisis, what you have is hundreds of thousands of people signing up for mortgages that they didn't understand, that the regulators were not on top of, and which they never had any prospect of being able to pay. And so what you had is a totally flawed product that people were making money off of at all different levels, but you didn't have the base of understanding in the citizenry for people to say, well, this is too good to be true. I mean, this can't work. I mean, if my monthly payment's going to double, you know, year after next, and I can barely make it now, you know, how in the world am I going to make double this, you know, a year and a half from now? And so, as I say, I've been spending decades talking, but I think I'm for what you're talking about. I haven't thought much about it, but I'm for it. Yes.
You talk about the political environment. There seems to be a lot of dysfunction. You allude to that. There's a lack of stability. Could you put it in historical context in terms of the level that we're seeing of dysfunction and lack of stability?
Huh. Another interesting question. I certainly can't do it as well as some historians could. The thing that strikes me most now about the dysfunction is something that does come from my Washington experiences. And that is that when I first worked with Senator Muskie in the Senate or Senator Mondale in the Senate, and during the 4 years I was in the White House, we were back and forth to the Capitol Hill, it seems like every other day, you know, working on legislation or working on presidential priorities. There was a kind of a permanent, sensible, bipartisan, collegial middle, right? There now doesn't seem to be any middle in Washington. And so what's happened for a variety of reasons is that both political parties, both the Republicans and Democrats, used to be more diverse in terms of the views that members of that party had. And so you had a lot of Democrats, called at one point Reagan Democrats, who had a kind of conservative social agenda, many of whom were against choice and abortion, and you know, there were a whole different range of points of view in both parties. Slowly what's happened now, basically in the last 30 years, is that this sort of analytically based patriotic middle has kind of disappeared. And so bipartisan cooperation now in legislation is at an all-time low. You know, when I first worked for Mondale in the Senate, he had a half a dozen Republican senators at a time who he was co-sponsoring legislation with. But as the parties have become more homogeneous, the other thing that's happened in a big way is that the fundraising for parties has become nationalized. So it used to be that people were elected in a state, and if it was a reasonably small state without a lot of big business community or a lot of rich people, whatever, you'd have members of Congress or people running for governor or running for the Senate or whatever, who might be spending, you know, 5 or 10% of what somebody might spend in California to run statewide. But California had all those extra tens of millions of people, and they were raising the money there, and they turned out to have very expensive elections. Now, if you look like Nevada, again this time, and you look at tens of millions of dollars pouring in, those tens of millions of dollars now are pouring into these races all over the country, but they're not pouring in for people who are in that sensible middle. There are people who are all on the Republican creed or all on the Democratic creed. And, you know, with a slight variance here and there, but basically the homogeneity of it has been further reinforced by the nationalization of the funding process.
But then you lay on top of that the lack of stability in the conversation.
Yes.
Driven by the extreme. Disenfranchised probably most of us, there's someplace in between. But then the lack of stability in the conversation becomes destructive, not only to the public dialogue, but it starts to permeate down into the organization, into the country.
Oh yeah, and it's one of the sources of alienation. I mean, if you look now, my wife teaches in Massachusetts, and I have a bunch of friends up there. We were sitting with some of the political leadership in Massachusetts a month or so ago. A friend of mine who was the caucus's chief of staff, a very thoughtful guy, he said, "I've got a statistic you won't guess no matter how many times you guess." And I said, "What's that?" He said, 47% of the Massachusetts electorate now say they're independents. right? I mean, people don't like this sort of dialogue, gridlock, anger, lack of civility, you know, two warring parties unable to find any common ground. It's one of the reasons now why people are so negative about Washington. It's not trivial. I think it's a big challenge to our democracy. I was telling Bill Antholis about a session I'd had at Brookings recently, and it seems to me, and I found out subsequently that Bill and some others have been working on this, but it's a perfect example of the sort of thing that Brookings should be working on. Now, as a long-term objective, what could we do by way of reform, structural change, encouragement, honoring people, whatever, that would in fact reconstruct some sort of sensible middle. And it's not just middle ideologically, but it's also in terms of a problem-solving orientation, civility, communication, cooperation. And you know, Obama talked about it in an extremely convincing way, I think, during the campaign. The Obama people now would say, well, we did everything we could to extend an olive branch and to work cooperatively and so on. On the other hand, most of America thinks it's gotten worse, not better, in the last 2 years. And so even with that kind of thrust, we're not making any positive progress. And it deserves, I think, attention of a lot of people. Mr. President.
For the last 3 decades, we've sent manufacturing jobs to other countries while we grew our technology, infrastructure, and export capabilities. But we exchanged with the other countries because we brought their smartest people here. And we did it for decades. And we had H-1B visas flowing like water, and they drove the most prosperous time in our history, probably. And then 9/11 came along, and the Patriot Act came along, and we kind of closed the borders to smart people from all over. And I guess what I'd ask you is, how is America going to make its way in the world if we have now the lowest plummeting science and technology literacy rates amongst American students, and we're not importing smart brains, and we've given away manufacturing, and we're losing technology?
Well, the answer, sir, is change our policy. We must change our policy on HB1 visas. We must continue to be the magnet for people all over the world who want to come and see what I flat out say is the superiority of our higher education system, our great universities. And it's just got to move up the agenda of priorities for everybody sitting in a chair like the one you're sitting in every dialogue with every senator and House member. It is, in fact, absolutely vital to the future of the country. And so we can't, we've got a formula now that's built to fail, right? We must change the formula, change the policy, and get back more or less where we used to be. And I think if we do, I think America, whatever we've lost over these years of people saying we've lost this and we've lost that and so on, there is still an enormous beacon, I think, to the rest of the world of what a great country we are and how innovative we are and how good our science is and how great our universities are. And I don't mind being in competition with China or India or Germany or anywhere else. If we don't have one or two hands tied behind our back, you know, I believe we can outcompete anybody. And I believe that we can be also substantially more attractive than any place else as a place to live and to learn and to work and to create and to be an entrepreneur. And so I don't despair that somehow we have irretrievably given up the leadership status that we had for so long. I just think we need to get the policy squared away. Somebody, Bill, how long am I supposed to go here? Have I gone too long, or am I okay? Or?
Mr. President, Bill Brown, do we go till 7?
Oh,
More questions?
couple more questions, okay. Ooh, lots of hands. I guess I have, yeah. Go ahead.
Your last experience in the financial industry, I just want your view on the current bonus structure pays in New York, specifically in the financial sector. Like, you think that we can continue to let high executives get these ginormous bonuses, or how can we restructure everything so maybe in a healthy state of economy over time?
The question for those of you who couldn't hear is it sustainable to continue to pay people in the financial industry what they're being paid? Is that a fair?
And, you know, your view on if there's a solution, what would you recommend?
Well, this, are there lawyers in the room? In interest of full disclosure, I chair the compensation committee of Goldman Sachs. So I've spent the last 12 years in the middle of every one of these questions. And that doesn't mean you should trust my judgment here, but actually this is something I know a lot about. And the long and short of it is that people in the major banks are paid an enormous sum of money, but that the theory of that for a very long period of time was that you pay for performance. And if you are running a line of business where you make $1 billion and you're personally responsible for guiding that business, then it's not unreasonable that you might be paid $25 or $50 million for the work that you did that year because you provided the company and the shareholders with an enormous return. On the other hand, I think there is a very widespread feeling that no matter how much money you earned for your company, that there is some level of personal compensation that simply doesn't meet the smell test and is too much. Now, the problem that a firm like JP Morgan has, or Morgan Stanley, or Goldman Sachs, or whatever, is that even though Goldman Sachs has 35,000 extremely talented people, and they love the company, we have unbelievably high morale, on any given day, any one of them can leave a voicemail saying, I no longer work there. I've gone to work for Henry Kravis at KKR. And if you look at what these major financial institutions, regulated, shareholder-owned, pay their key people, it turns out to be dramatically less than people who are working at hedge funds, who are doing money management, who are working in private equity firms, who are owners of private equity firms or hedge funds or money management firms, or people who are simply out as entrepreneurs on their own. And so you say, okay, first of all, most people say, I don't believe that. I don't believe that these people can go get another job somewhere. If they're paid $50 million at JP Morgan, I don't believe that they can go get a $50 million a year job somewhere else. Well, they all can't. That's true. On the other hand, the thing that makes Goldman Sachs or another firm like it superior over a period of time is having the very best people and training those people for decades in some cases to run unbelievably complex businesses. So what I'm always stuck with when people say, aren't you overpaying people at Goldman Sachs? I typically say, we may be giving them way too much cash. We may be rewarding short-termism in one form or another. We probably should be giving them all of their pay virtually in stock. We should probably give virtually all of their pay in slow vesting stock, meaning that they have to stay and see the results of what they've done over a long period of time to make sure that it wasn't an illusion that they actually made the money. But when I sit there and say, okay, are we prepared to lose our top 200 people to miscellaneous hedge funds and private equity funds and independent money management firms and so on that are not shareholder owned, that are not regulated the way we are, I say I can't responsibly do that as a director of Goldman Sachs. I can't define a compensation strategy which guarantees that we destroy the firm. And so it sounds a little bit like excuse making, and I suppose at one level it is a little bit like excuse making. But I think you have to go down as well as up, right? So if people have a bad year, the firm has a bad year, we have taken our top people down dramatically so that the year before last, our CEO at Goldman made zero. Last year, he was the 157th most highly paid person in the firm. This is the chairman and CEO. because we were still not fully recovered from the 2007, 8, 9 trauma. On the other hand, at some point people are going to say, thanks but no thanks in terms of being a major executive of JP Morgan or whatever, Morgan Stanley. If I can go get paid dramatically better somewhere else, part of the American capitalist culture is, that's what you're expected to do, or that's what people will do. And so I find it very complicated. And we're just beginning the comp season again now. Tomorrow from my hotel room here in Las Vegas, I will have the first round on 2010 compensation and what that might look like. And I don't think the answers are so easy. I mean, we could say no one in America should make more than $5 million or $10 million or $1 million or whatever, but that's not our society. Our society is to say, this is an opportunity society. And if you go out and you create, the best new car ever, or the best new company ever, or the best new hospitality strategy ever, you and your shareholders have, under the American system, more or less the right to get rich. And that we shouldn't have a lot of government-imposed artificial ceilings on what people can earn. Now, if they don't earn it, that's something else. Or if they don't go down when their business goes down, that's something else. But if you say, okay, we pay for performance, you go out and make $1 billion, you get paid well. I think that's pretty close to the core of our national orientation to performance and money. And so I don't think we want to get very far away from that. I think I think the inequality of success in Americans, let's go to the last question quickly before we lose our audience. Yes, go ahead. Yell it out.
I'd love to get your insight.
Make it short.
I'd love to get your insight on being from the inside and seeing the mortgage meltdown happen from the other side of the wall. I'd love to get your insight on how it happened, because in my opinion, there's two answers. One, it was ignorance, or two, it was criminal. Because how did we get to that position? How do we let so many things
I think
go
it was
wrong?
ignorance, criminal, and an unbelievable lack of regulatory oversight. I mean, everybody knew these mortgages weren't going to be paid, and they went from the originator into Wall Street, into the securities, out as AAA securities, and it seemed like nobody felt it was their job to blow the whistle and say, this can't possibly succeed over time. And I'll spare the normal commercial I give for myself at this point about how when I was at Fannie Mae everything was great, but time's up. Thank you.
Great fun.
Thank you. It's a good group.
Interesting hearing some of this stuff.